Back to Operations Committee. It's meeting number 29, House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, of course, widely known everywhere as the mighty OGO, the only committee that matters. Welcome back, Mr. Jakes, and your team. We have you here today for the Supplementary Estimates Cs and other recent reports. You have an opening statement for us, sir?
I do, Mr. Chair.
Please, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Colleagues, just briefly, after about an hour and a half, we'll suspend for a few minutes to set up for the OECD, and then we'll have probably 6 interventions for about 35 minutes with them. Sorry, Mr. Jakes, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chair, distinguished members, thank you for the invitation to appear today. Earlier this week, we published a report on the Supplementary Estimates C. These supplementary estimates outline $4 billion in new budgetary spending. Voted authorities, which require approval by Parliament, total $5.4 billion. Statutory authorities, for which the government already has Parliament's approval to spend, are forecast to decrease by a total of $1.4 billion, mostly driven by a decrease in planned spending on elderly benefits. Including these supplementary estimates, the total proposed year-to-date budgetary authorities are $510 billion, which represents a $24 billion increase compared to the estimates to date last year. Major areas of planned spending include defense and the Canada Post Corporation. Roughly 12%, or close to $500 million, relates to 13 Budget 2025 measures. Of note, as well as our report on Supplementary Estimate C, was the first ever OECD review of Canada's Parliamentary Budget Office, which was also published earlier this week. As noted in previous committee testimony, I commissioned the OECD to undertake this review on my very first day of appointment as interim PBO in September of last year. It seems like so long ago. After almost 20 years, I thought that an external evaluation of the office was long overdue. I will now continue in French. In November,
the OECD review team met with parliamentarians, government officials, former parliamentary budget officers, and other stakeholders as part of their study. As I have mentioned to some of you, when I asked the OECD to review the office, I specifically requested that they provide a roadmap to sustain our institution as one of the best among OECD countries. I am pleased to say that they have done all that and more. Their recommendations lay out a clear path to safeguard the office's independence and sustain its top performance. We have already started to implement many of the OECD's recommendations. I look forward to continuing this work with whomever the Prime Minister nominates to be Canada's next Parliamentary Budget Officer. In closing, I would like to say that our office remains determined to provide Parliament with credible, timely, and non-partisan analysis to support your work. We would be pleased to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jakes. Before we start, I want to congratulate you and your predecessor, Mr. Giroux, and the rest of your team for being identified by the OECD as the top in class for the entire OECD for PBO or like peers. So congratulations again to you and Mr. Giroux. Madam Locke, you're first up for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And while you stole my thunder, I will also go ahead and congratulate the PBO on being ranked #1 in the world by the OECD. We recognize that this is the result of the PBO doing many things right. Having said that, there are recommendations in this report, and we would expect that because there is perhaps always room for improvement. And they suggest that this would further cement your position as an international leader in fiscal oversight. So one of the recommendations that the OECD included was that there be a way to have parliamentary involvement in interim appointments, and that this could be to require secondary approval from a committee. What a novel idea. In November, I put forward a motion that was passed by this committee that would have sought to do this very thing, to have possible candidates for the position of the PBO interviewed by the subcommittee of OGO. In response to that motion, a spokesperson from the PMO said, and I quote, "They didn't feel bound by the direction from the committee, and they offered that the Privy Council, in their refusal to include us in the process, protects the confidentiality of applicants." And now we know that parliamentarians often deal with very confidential information. We hold in-camera meetings to do just that. So I guess what I'm wondering is if you would be willing to speak to this recommendation and any others that require action from parliamentarians.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. So broadly speaking, of the 5 key recommendations identified by the OECD, I would say 2 of them squarely fall in the lap of parliamentarians. And those relate to legislative amendments, or legislative amendments that the OECD recommends based upon their consultations with virtually all stakeholders, including the government. So it represents a plurality of views. So this is not exclusively an OECD perspective. It's important to understand that they heard this from many stakeholders. And as well, as part of the review process around this report, it was circulated with many external reviewers, other jurisdictions, including the Committee of Senior Budget Officials, of which the Department of Finance Canada is a part. So it's a recommendation that is not uniquely sent to us from the good folks in Paris. For the legislative amendments, again, the legislation is what the legislation is. Parliament has decided that they decided to provide the Prime Minister and the government with discretion around the interim appointment, more discretion than currently exists for the permanent nominee PBO. Should Parliament decide to change that, certainly on the appointment side, something that I believe I mentioned on September 15th as part of my first committee testimony here at the Government Operations Committee is it would certainly be beneficial. And first and foremost, it would be beneficial with respect to the stability, the operating stability of the institution. So Mr. Giroux, his term came to an end. He received a phone call on his final day indicating he was not being renewed. And maybe 24 hours before that, I received a request to step in. And it's just not a good way to manage the office as a whole. More importantly, any shortcomings or any additional challenges in our end result in lower quality services for parliamentarians. And as the Prime Minister and the government has pointed out on numerous occasions, Budget 2025 is potentially the most important budget in a generation. Over the coming weeks, we're looking at potentially the most important aspect of parliamentary financial cycle. Main estimates came down this morning, departmental plans in the next 2 weeks. Shortly after that, we're looking at a spring update as well, all of which involve cuts of $60 billion, layoffs of 40,000 FTEs, and substantial investments on the defense side. Parliamentarians need that support. Well, we're certainly well placed to provide it, and providing additional stability to the office, the Parliamentary Budget Office that serves parliamentarians, puts parliamentarians further ahead overall.
Thank you very much. With my 1 minute left, I would simply state that it's one thing to provide that further discretionary when it comes to appointing a budget officer on an interim basis, but even even appointing someone on an interim basis is not a best practice, as noted in the OECD report. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. And something I mentioned to the committee, and I think many members in this room, was I was very surprised and somewhat taken aback following my appointment, the questions that were raised by parliamentarians and put to me directly with respect to my partisanship. So the method of the appointment created a perception of partisanship very quickly out of the gate. I was asked by many parliamentarians and staffers how well I knew the Prime Minister, how many times I met the Prime Minister, if I was a member of the Liberal Party of Canada, if I had donated to the Liberal Party of Canada, and no one should have to deal with that. And more importantly, as the OECD points out, for an institution that is widely respected as being impartial and independent, having a process for nomination for an interim appointment that leads to that specific outcome just makes no sense. It undermines the entire raison d'etre of having an independent parliamentary budget office.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ms. Washworth, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jacques, and I'll maybe expand a bit more further on that particular issue. It is important to note that the OECD review concludes that Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer is one of the strongest independent fiscal institutions internationally. Do you agree with that statement?
Mm-hmm. I agree with the statement, and I would say it's less about the officer and it's more about the institution. I would also say more broadly, and something that really stands out to me in comparison to other jurisdictions, it is also about parliamentarians. So in comparison to other jurisdictions, parliamentarians use our work to a much greater extent. This will be my 24th appearance at committee since September. I'm now in hour 39 of public testimony, going into hour 40 in a couple of minutes. That doesn't happen in other jurisdictions. We have close to 6 to 7 committee requests with respect to analytical work. And I do think that on our end, the team certainly does a very good job. It really comes from the use of the work by parliamentarians, people such as yourself, and the fact that parliamentarians are interested in numbers and they're interested in facts and they're interested as part of their policy debates to have good numbers that they trust supporting those debates. So it very much is a team effort. The institution, from my perspective, the institution wouldn't be recognized by the OECD as being one of the best in the world if we didn't have some of the best parliamentarians in the world.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That's a good statement. No, exactly. So we should applaud that as well, actually. Well, actually, on that point as well, for many years, your office, this committee, has raised concerns about the disconnect between federal budgets and the estimates, as well as limited visibility, I think, as you've pointed out, into frozen allotments that only become fully clear in the public accounts. And so now as we shift, I mean, we're acting on some of these comments, on some of these concerns that have been raised, with the shift to a fall budget cycle and improved alignment in supplementary estimates. Are you satisfied? Do you view this as progress? How would you comment on that?
Yeah, it certainly, to your point, it certainly responds to some of the observations that we made in the past with respect to the lack of alignment between the budget and the estimates. And again, those observations that we made, they very much came from parliamentarians. So parliamentarians, again, I've been on the Hill for the past 20 years. There were observations made by parliamentarians with respect to the lack of coherence between the budget and the estimates. That's something that parliamentarians raised with the government, but all flavors of government, they raised with ourselves, and the government has responded, and it's definitely a good step forward.
Is it? I was just reading somewhere that it is 5 weeks that the parliamentarians are given to examine the supplementary estimates. Do you feel that now is a sufficient amount of time?
It's really not up to us to opine around how much time should be provided to parliamentarians. Again, when we reach conclusions with respect to the process, it's very much based upon the feedback from parliamentarians. So parliamentarians identify that they feel that they're being rushed or they require additional time, then that's something that we will flag more broadly within a report. I'd say for my part, I respect the fact that parliamentarians are very busy people, And in addition to, I think that the parliamentary financial cycle is the most important thing that parliamentarians work on. But I am horribly biased, and I do recognize the parliamentarians work on a lot of other really important things, and they have to make tough trade-offs or tough decisions regarding how they actually spend their time.
I'm not sure if I have a minute left. 2 minutes. Okay. I want to just zero in on the on vote 50. Certainly, as Canada accelerates, we know our defence investments and works towards meeting its international security commitments. Mechanisms like Treasury Board Vote 50 are intended to provide the flexibility within the supply process. And so I was just wondering how you view this tool in terms of, from a transparency perspective. Do you view it as a transparent contingency tool that can benefit Canada?
Yeah, I think similar to the other central votes that the Treasury Board Secretary has created, both those that are currently in place and then, again, thinking back over the past 2 decades, it certainly can be transparent, and as long as the government is being clear with respect to how the money is being transferred and how it's being allocated. I would say going outside, or I guess supplementing what's in the Supplementary Estimate C with additional reporting outside of that, potentially on a website indicating how the money is being transferred to government departments, not having to wait until the public accounts are tabled. That's something that could definitely be of benefit. And again, on our end, unlike the Auditor General has the privilege and challenge of working within a really clear framework of accounting standards. So things can be black and white, and there's some gray, but things are a lot clearer. Whereas in our situation, in terms of things like TB Vote 50, where there is additional discretion that would be provided by Parliament to the government around managing this $1 billion fund, it's really up to parliamentarians to decide if the operational benefits for government outweigh the, I guess, ceding additional control to the government and the Treasury Board Secretariat. But that's very much a question, again, for parliamentarians.
Oh, I appreciate that answer. And that actually is it for me for now.
That's it.
Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, I'm happy to learn, and I'm proud to see the OECD's review. It's important to highlight that. And it's important to state it because of the credibility and the effectiveness of your work. I'm very grateful. So, to me, it's unacceptable to have any judgment toward the impartiality that wouldn't be 100%. So I would stand up for that. So I have a number of questions. If I've counted correctly, the interim position ends in 4 days, and you don't have any news on that? No, not yet. There are still 4 days. It's true. We are eagerly awaiting news from the Government of Canada on the next PBO. So the committee had proposed an impartial process to ensure the legitimacy of your office. And in addition, you only have 4 days left. You have no news. I have a lot of sympathy for the whole team. I wanted to note that. I find that unacceptable. So these central votes, 4.5 billion. Dozens of organizations have presented additional needs. Is that volume unusual? Does that reflect a problem in budgetary planning at the beginning?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the number of organizations, I have to admit I don't have the numbers with me compared to other supplementary estimate C. But in terms of the amount, this year was relatively low compared to other years. So I would tend to say since the amount was lower, the number of organizations is probably a little lower than in the past. I imagine in a big institution like the government, it can be difficult to have the right planning in real time. For my information, I'd like to know the PBO for assessing the voted appropriations versus statutory expenditures in supplementary estimates. Can there be strategic placement of that? A transfer between votes? Well, we've seen, and I think in all of the estimates, it's in the Subs B as well, there are reallocations between vote 1 to vote 5, for example, capital towards operational or vice versa. So this year I don't think there were more than usual. And the organizations that ask for those transfers have to obtain approval from Parliament. And second, they're supposed to provide justification to the Secretariat of the Treasury Board before they can request that transfer with the supplementary estimates. I think it's an opportunity for parliamentarians when they invite officials and ministers to explain specifically some of those transfers, because we don't have all of the information for each one of them. I'm very concerned when we talk about equity and impartiality, when we talk about the regulatory sandboxes. So I wanted to demystify that. Regarding the $1 billion for Canada Post, because we know that's a reimbursable loan, a repayable loan. So that's a shortfall. There's still money bleeding. So based on your analysis, is this temporary support or a sign that that structure is not going to last? Thank you for your question. I will answer in English.
Post. Under Article 31 of the Canada Post Act, the Minister of Finance is able to place at the disposal of that corporation such amounts that are needed for it to continue to operate. In Section 32.1 of that same Act, it requires Canada Post to reimburse government from its annual revenues should there be sufficient funds available. And then if there are not, there is Section 32.2 of that Act, where if revenues from the corporation are insufficient to pay back what was given under Article 31, the Minister of Finance can cause the insufficiency to be included in a deficit appropriation item in the next estimates.
Parce que, dans le fond, on se demande...
Because in the end, we're wondering, and we're still awaiting answers. We don't have all the answers yet. We're wondering, what about its main role and the goal of Canada Post to serve? Because there are a number of places. I'm going to the Ile de la Madeleine. If there's no Canada Post, it's about medical items and other things. Okay, I have 30 seconds left. Defense and security. The creation of the central vote allows Treasury Board to substitute other votes. Would this be for acceleration or to circumvent the usual processes in the budget?
Sir, sorry.
Le gouvernement de Canada.
The government of Canada used the same approach in the past, and maybe in the next round I can add more details. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Answer, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks again for coming to committee. Really appreciate the good work that you do. I just wanted to start off quickly with the issue around the elapsed or frozen funding. I noticed in your report it mentions that roughly 27% is all that's really been reported on as a percentage, and it's unclear with the other 73%. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on what that means and if there's any clever accounting happening with these frozen allotments.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So this number was obtained by comparing the frozen allotments, the permanent frozen allotments in Supplementary Estimate C against what you find, the total permanent frozen allotments that you find in the public accounts. And what we wanted to highlight is that theoretically, what you find in supplementary estimates would technically be a leading indicator of what you would find in the public accounts and potentially what is about to last. But based on the figures that we've seen in the last few years, it doesn't really give you an indication of the permanent frozen allotments numbers that you will find in the public accounts. So that's where that 26% average comes from.
Right, but that would kind of also indicate that there's a bit of a lack of transparency then on what's happening there too. Would that be correct?
I would say that it certainly doesn't inform you more. It doesn't inform you on how much the government will potentially lapse.
And when there wasn't a supplementary C tabled last year either, that didn't help either, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just wondering too, because a lot of it is on the graph that you have in the report, that a lot of it will just be carried forward into the next fiscal year. We've heard from you guys in the past that there's a lot of funding that is reannounced, and not necessarily new funding, but just reannounced funding. When you looked into this, did you see any things that were just reannouncements that were added into, rather than new budgetary items? How much of it was carry forward versus actual new commitment?
So in line with what you're saying, what we did notice was in the budget 2025 in supplementary estimate C, there were measures that were that receive appropriations from prior, or I would say earlier estimates, and those measures were considered budget measures because they were reintroduced in the budget. So we wanted, for transparency, we did want to highlight that.
Thank you. Just a little bit more on the issue around Canada Post. The Kaplan report said with the last year's loan, and said that the repayment repayment would require the complete suspension of disbelief. They're getting another over $1 billion allotted in this update that we are seeing now, and it's the same terms, which is outlined in the Canada Post Act, that they may repay this if they are able to become solvent. In your research into this at all, have you got any indication that Canada Post will be able to get to a point where they could at least begin repaying the last loan, never mind the loan that they are now asking for in this update?
So looking at their annual reports for the last 10 years or so, they've not been profitable on a net income basis since 2017, and there has not been a profitable year on an operating basis since 2020. However, the operating margin was negative in 2018 and 0.1 in 2019, so it precedes the pandemic by a few years.
Yeah, and it's 5 years ago there was a strategic plan submitted to the government, and nothing's been done on it. Do you think this is just a little bit absurd that they could keep coming back asking for money without being afforded the ability to actually make the changes required to at least try and right the ship?
Say on our end, it's outside of our mandate to comment on how the government of Canada manages its decision-making processes around crown corporations.
Right, but just as a general practice, though, right? Like I understand that you're not going to get into the weeds on it, and I do appreciate that. But just when we look at how taxpayers' money is being spent, they are repayable loans, but there's a basically an opt-out that there's no incentive really to repay it. And I think that's the problem that Canadians are seeing with this, is they can keep coming back every year, $1 billion, $1 billion, $1 billion. They're not given the ability to make the changes, and this keeps happening over and over again. Is that not problematic?
Sorry to interrupt you. There's no time left for a response, so perhaps we can get back to Mr. Patzer next time. Mr. Osborne, please go ahead, sir.
Vince, yeah. It's Vince.
Mr. Gasparo, go ahead.
I was insulted there, Chair. Thank you.
This is what your party gave me, so go ahead. I'll start the clock. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you again for coming, Mr. Jacques and team. I just want to quickly start with the frozen allotments, and then we can go to the OECD report if that's okay. In your report, you note, and this is coming off of what my Conservative colleague mentioned earlier or was alluding to, but in your report, you note that the frozen allotments have been disclosed in the supplementary estimates C since 2015, 2016. My first question is, what was the practice before that, particularly during the decade that Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government was in power?
So the prior practice was that there was nothing disclosed. And being the person that I believe wrote the analysis for Supplementary Estimate C the first time that the government released the information around frozen allotments, I think we highlighted it as a good positive step forward for transparency overall.
I'm glad you stated that for the record. So the fact that the introduction of this reporting, it actually represents increased transparency rather than a lack of transparency. I just wanted to make sure that was stated for the record. So I appreciate that. Moving to the OECD report. In its review, the OECD placed strong emphasis on nonpartisan communication. How does your office interpret this recommendation in a particularly highly charged political environment? And will the PBO consider formalizing a communication process as was recommended?
So yeah, I'm very familiar with that recommendation. The OECD, when they shared a draft report with us prior to Christmas, they highlighted this, and I was immediately struck by two things. The first being, holy cow, why haven't we done this before? Quickly followed by a slightly sickening feeling of the operational risk to the office of not having what you're mentioning in place. And that's why last month we actually released our first ever communication strategy for the office, our first ever communication policy for the office, and our first ever errata policy for the office. So I think many people in this room are probably good users of our website. And if you go to our website and you look at a report on the website, you'll now see that there's a hyperlink for errata. So it was something, and again, the policies themselves and the approach, there are some new aspects to the approach. I would say a recurring theme throughout the OECD report in communications and in other areas is that we were doing these things, we simply hadn't written them down. And that created two issues. The first is when we do have a situation where we have somebody who's a very strong leader, Mr. Giroux, who moves on, it means that when there is a transition, there's a risk that there are going to be operating setbacks to the office if you don't have a good policy framework in place. The other issue is it's not transparent. So we were not walking the talk. So the idea that as an organization with a legislative mandate to promote fiscal transparency, we ourselves were operating in a non-transparent way when it came to issues around communications. It was certainly not helpful. So that's in place. I think it largely addresses most of the recommendations from the OECD report on the communication side. Certainly, we're going to see how those settle, and we're open to suggestions and feedback from parliamentarians if there need to be additional changes. There are other administrative changes that we're in the midst of looking at, and again, we're waiting until the government appoints a new Parliamentary Budget Officer next week to sit down with that individual and work through some of the additional administrative changes that the OECD has recommended.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
That's basically our time. Madame Gaudreau, please, for 2.5.
D'entrée de jeu,
Thank you. At the outset, having set out a number of policies of the sort, it's beneficial for all parties because it provides protection, but at the same time, it gives legitimacy in doing one's work with the communication policy. So I appreciate that. Now, so Central Vote 50C, supplementing other appropriations, would this accelerate things, or would this circumvent things, circumvent the usual practice? As I started to explain, the Government of Canada, the Treasury Board Secretariat, used the same approach with the other central votes in the past. And in this situation, it's to support other departments when there's a certain level of flux with the resources in some departments concerning defense and security spending. It's different in comparison with the standard approach of managing money for the Government of Canada, because typically with each transfer there's an obligation to explicitly identify the amount and to regarding the details and approval from Parliament. And it's a question for parliamentarians, for MPs to determine if the flexibility in that type of situation, if there's a justification, a strong enough justification for sharing control by Parliament with the Government of Canada. Do you have the information when you ask for it to allow us to have them concerning Central Vote 50? No. Not yet. Not yet. After the meeting today, we can ask the Treasury Board Secretariat. Earlier, Mr. Chair, or later I'll talk about QDAM and Radio Canada.
Please.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to talk about the defense spending report. I was trying to wrap my mind around this enormous number. And so what I kind of understand is the federal government collects about 17 cents out of every dollar that the Canadian economy produces. And under this new NATO framework, defense and security spending could rise to 5 cents. So that would leave us with 12 cents for all of our other spending. Now, if our revenue remains about 17% of GDP, that means close to 1/3 of our federal revenue would go to defense and security. And it's not a marginal adjustment. It makes defense one of the dominant pillars of federal spending. It would represent a very different fiscal profile from Canada that Canada has historically had. So now I want to consider the industrial side. Large-scale defense manufacturing is capital intensive. To sustain it efficiently, most countries rely on export markets. The United States does, France, Germany, and the UK. If Canada builds production capacity beyond what we need for our own security, then one of two things happens. Either we permanently maintain elevated domestic military demand, or we participate meaningfully in global defense export markets. So here's my question. Given that Canada has long positioned itself as a middle power focused on multilateralism and peacekeeping, does expanding defense production at this scale represent a material shift in our fiscal priorities and even in our national identity?
Thank you. Thank you for the very complicated question. We're always kept on our toes. So I can certainly answer the fiscal component. So there are two parts. There are two parts from my own perspective. There are two interesting parts to the question that you're asking. The first is well within our bailiwick with respect to the fiscal side. So we published a report on the NATO 5% target and the potential fiscal implications, which, again, the numbers that you cited in terms of the 17 cents on every dollar, or 70% of GDP, getting to 5 cents of that with respect to NATO, that's correct. It would be a substantial increase. Within the NATO 5% report that we published, we did point out that going from 2 to 5%, about half of that, the government's indicated it would be, they believe that they're already spending on other areas that are potentially dual use or dual purpose. That said, would be 5 cents out of the potential 17 cents if there are no other changes on the revenue side, which would be a substantial difference in the allocation of spending in comparison to what we've seen in the past. With respect to the question that you raised with respect to the change in the composition or the nature of the Canadian economy, it's something that definitely caught my eye because up to this point, we've been looking at this as a fiscal question in terms of how much will this cost and over what period of time. The defense policy last week was interesting because it indicated it's also an economic question. So in comparison to the past where the government was focusing on spending the money to acquire military kit, now it's spending the money to acquire military kit and also substantially expanding the defense industry within the country. And in many situations supporting the creation of firms that currently don't exist to get to a 70% domestic spending target. And in a context where we currently have a bit of an output gap, so there's currently some slack in the economy, which we expect to close over time. But in the context where the government's going to be pushing very strongly around the restructuring, restructuring the Canadian economy in this area and expanding it, it will change the nature of how the economy operates overall.
Okay, so I just have a kind of a follow-up question. Since we're increasing defense spending so dramatically, and apparently the Prime Minister is planning to sign a defense cooperation agreement on his trip to India this week, my question is defense becoming just a security function of it, just a security function, or is it becoming a central economic strategy? I think that's the main question that I have. I'm not sure you can answer it, but perhaps during your study of this issue, you ran into some information you didn't include in your report.
I would say so to answer your question, we did not include the economic context or the changing economic context in our report because we were waiting for the defense strategy that was published after we published our NATO 5%, subsequent to our NATO 5% report. And again, it is a substantial difference in comparison to the approach the government's taken in the past, and including on the export side. So it was very explicitly identified within that report that there would be a shift to, in addition to creating domestic capacity to meet Canada's needs, also supporting the exports of military equipment and hardware. So that's certainly different.
Now, Mr. Osborne, we'll try you.
Thank you. And just following up, I guess, on the last question, you did say that the increase in defence spending would change the nature of our economy, and I agree with that as well. In your opinion, the 5 of 17 cents with an increased defence infrastructure spend, Canada has just signed on, I believe, to SAFE, which is a European group in which we may be able to export components that are manufactured in Canada as part of that group. They would rely on us, we would rely on them. But in terms of the defence industry and an expanded a part of our economy, how would the 5 of 17 cents look, in your opinion, as we move forward?
I would say I would hopefully, I'll punt the question to the next PBO, and we will go back to the office and analyze it in detail. Because to your point, there are characteristics of the defense industry and the security industry that are different than other sectors in the economy. So thinking about the export orientation, the research and development intensity, productivity levels, and there's also a question of the government's ability or Canada's ability to execute on this strategy, because it's ambitious and it's definitely moving in a different direction. So I'd say on our end, it's better that we go back and actually analyze it before we opine upon it. Yep. But the next PBO will definitely have a very comprehensive answer. I'll put them on the hook right now. The next time they appear before this committee, they will have a comprehensive response.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that answer. I would anticipate that ratio would change as the infrastructure component of national defence expands, but it would be nice to get some indication as to what that may look like. In our changing geopolitical world, I think it would be naive not to, and I'm not asking for an opinion because you are non-political and non-biased, but I would think that it would be naive of of our country not to increase defence spending, in addition to the fact that it would have huge benefits for the economy as we continue to grow. We are becoming less reliant on our neighbours to the south and more reliant on other reliable trading partners. Just looking at, I guess, some of the recommendations from the OECD, they put a strong emphasis on neutrality and nonpartisan communication. How does your office interpret this recommendation, particularly in light of the highly charged political environment that the House of Commons is, and will you consider formalising a process as was recommended?
Yeah, a process needs to be formalized. Things were, again, as I mentioned in reference to my age, things were partisan 20 years ago, and they're certainly more partisan now and certainly more heated. For what reason, anyone can speculate. And I would also say, in addition to the policies themselves, something else that the OECD pointed out that I think is worth mentioning is there should be, I agree with the OECD's recommendation and observation that there's a benefit in having a shift away from the PBO as an individual, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to the Parliamentary Budget Office. And in particular, if you look at other jurisdictions, including our neighbours to the south and the Congressional Budget Office, the Congressional Budget Office will also appear at committee hearings in their House and Senate. Often it's not the director of the office. Most often it's the analysts who appear. They appear for a short period of time, 30 minutes. They answer technical questions with respect to the reports. And then once parliamentarians or legislators are happy, they go away. And I do think in a highly partisan environment, it's a better way of us meeting the needs of parliamentarians. There might have been a justification 20 years ago in having a lot of emphasis on a single individual who is called the PBO. The context has changed, and we've moved well beyond that. And certainly from my perspective, and I think the OECD's perspective, we need to shift to an environment where it's the Parliamentary Budget Office meeting the needs of parliamentarians as opposed to the officer representing the officer's work, because everything that we do should be supporting your needs.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Jakes, you promised to have the new PBO follow up on Mr. Osborne's request. Why don't we just consider it an official request from the committee, just so that we can set priorities? Thanks very much. We'll now go to Mrs. Block.
I believe Mr. Gill should be on the list.
Okay. Mr. Gill.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Jakes, for being here, and appreciate your candidness and honest answers as always. Canadians were promised a fiscal guardrails, including a declining deficit to GDP ratio. Given your estimate of only about 7.5% probability of meeting that target, do these supplementary estimates move us closer to that path or further away? And are the pressures largely structural or temporary?
Thank you for the question. So the numbers that you're seeing in the Supplementary Estimate C were largely reflected in Budget 2025. So in terms of the spending path of the government spending path and fiscal guardrails, nothing would be substantially changed based upon what was in Budget 2025 and our observations around the probability of the government being able to respect its fiscal anchors. In terms of the structural versus the cyclical components, it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. Certainly there are structural components. So when you look out over the next 5 years and you see that even after the output gap, which is a nerdy technical economics term for even when the economy 3 or 4 years from now is firing on all cylinders, everyone who wants a job can get a job and everything's going great, we still have a fairly sizable federal deficit based upon our last outlook and based upon the outlook from the government. So it means that there's a structural deficit. There are cyclical components. So, and the government has highlighted that especially as part of their new economic strategy, the government is doubling down on additional capital investment at this point, which of course they need to borrow the money for. As we see, hopefully that'll be offset to a certain extent as they implement the cuts to the operating budget. So over time, we should see things potentially, hopefully we're going to see things improve.
Well, hope springs eternal, as we all know. But we have to have some concrete measures, structural issues that need to be corrected. And with that in mind, the growth we often see, or it's given to us in Parliament, is that we are the fastest growing economy. And yet the OECD analysis shows weak GDP per capita growth. Banks have indicated that we have been, some studies from the banks have indicated that we have been in a recession in terms of GDP growth over the past 3 to 4 years. Is Canada's revenue growth driven only by population increase, or do we expect some productivity gains? Do you see anything on the horizon that tells you that we might be pulling ourselves out of the population growth scenario as opposed to actual GDP growth?
Yeah, this morning, it's a very pertinent question because this morning we actually published our updated demographic outlook for Canada. And in that publication, to your point, we highlight that effectively population growth in the country probably flat in 2025, probably flat in 2026, going to start growing again at a rate that most people would be familiar with from prior to the pandemic, from 2027 onward. And notwithstanding that, the Canadian economy is continuing to grow. Something I've highlighted in the past is there continues to be productivity growth in the Canadian economy because the Canadian economy are Canadian people, and Canadians work hard, they learn, they work more efficiently and more effectively over time, and we've seen that. You go back over the time series, you look back over the history from StatCan over the past 40 or 50 years, and notwithstanding recessions, trade wars, or other hiccups in the economy and global affairs, the Canadian economy and Canadian workers always come back.
The debt trajectory that we have compared to other OECD countries, are we underperforming, overperforming? What can Canadians expect going forward, especially with the inflationary pressures that we are facing right now? Affordability is a huge issue. You have seniors resorting to having to, shoplift just to feed themselves. Where is all that going?
I'm afraid time is up. So perhaps your next round. We'll go to Ms. Khalid, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Just want to explore a little bit about frozen allotments and the variance that there is between frozen allotments that are reported in sub-Cs and in public accounts. Now, how much of that is due to timing, and how does that impact frozen allotments as being a key indicator or a leading indicator of the total frozen and lapsed funds that appear in public accounts?
Thank you for the question. By timing, do you mean the timing of the implementation of programs?
That's right.
Yes, so that would be reflected in permanent frozen allotments that are categorized as reprofiles. And as you can see in supplementary estimates C of this year, they make the bulk of the 7.4 billion. So I think it's about 5 billion of those that are reprofiled funds. And so I wouldn't be able to speak to how does that overall impact or indicate how much the government will lapse by the end of this year. But if you take a look at the annex, not the annex, but the document about frozen allotments that is tabled along with the supplementary estimates, you can find details per organization and the reason why the department is seeking to reprofile the funds as well as the specific amount.
How does that impact your work in PBO? Does it have any impact in terms of when the timing of the two different reports, with the frozen allotments and then the public accounts, the discrepancy there?
I would say we would call it less a question of being a discrepancy and more a question of a timing difference with respect to when it's reported. And again, going back to a response I provided to one of your colleagues, prior to 2015, we were only waiting on the public accounts, right? So there was nothing. So now to be in a situation where in 2015, the government ultimately decided to share additional information. It's not perfect and comprehensive, but they're sharing something, and ultimately it reconciles with what's in the public accounts, but it doesn't give us a perfect line of sight to ultimately what's published 8 months later. It's a good problem to have. And something I mentioned to this committee and to other parliamentarians in the past is I've never seen a public servant come to a committee hearing and be asked questions about, could you release additional non-confidential information? Could you put it on a website? Could you incorporate it as part of the existing financial reporting cycle? I've never seen a public servant say, no. I've only seen public servants say, sure, we're producing these documents for you so you can make better decisions. And if this is what you want and parliamentarians find it helpful, then they'll do it. I know I'm eating up your time. I apologize. The last thing, but it is important to always remember, with additional reporting, there's a cost associated with it to the government. And that's why on our end, even though it might not be perfect information, we're always very cognizant that public servants have full-time jobs, which is not responding to PBO requests. It's responding to ministers, implementing the government's agenda, and responding to parliamentarians. So even though the information they provide around frozen allotments might not be perfect, before we asked for more information, we would have to think long and hard about whether the additional $10,000 worth of taxpayer money spent on collecting that information was justified.
So just on that, one of the recommendations in the OECD report was about formalizing process of collecting data from different departments, whereas Canada has a more informal process of getting that information to you. What are your views on that, especially in terms of cost effectiveness as well?
So it's a great idea. It works in other jurisdictions. I think from my perspective, and I think my colleagues in the public service would agree with me, it works during election campaigns. So one of the aspects of our mandate is to support political parties in the costing of electoral platforms. During that costing period, we do have memorandum of understanding with various government departments, and the collaboration works very well. And it eliminates overlap and duplication. There's a free flow of information, and everything is kept in a confidential way. I think it should be done. From my own perspective, I don't know. I think it should be done. I think there'd be a real benefit, not only for us, but for you, and also for taxpayers. It is a very challenging. Mr. Gill asked the question, or he mentioned the affordability crisis.
Can I have one more question?
Sorry, it's a really challenging time, and certainly from our perspective, to the extent to which we can implement these changes without coming back, I don't think there's any need for our organization. We'll see if the new PBO agrees, but right now I think there's no need for our organization to come back and ask for additional taxpayer money to implement any of these recommendations. I think there's a great opportunity for better collaboration with the public service at this point.
Gaudreau, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's talk about QDM. 85,000 seniors have been victims of problems with the transition for the software. Has the PBO looked at the impact in budgetary terms, potentially, of these delays? No, not yet. Okay. Is it possible that an administrative delay, a long one, because it's 85,000 seniors we're talking about, could that temporarily reduce expected spending without reflecting a real decrease in need? Yes, absolutely. And we will be happy to analyze that question with a motion from your committee. And my last question on this, could we think that the lower predictions are due to administrative failings rather than demographic factors. I haven't seen the report, but clearly people are aging, even if it's stable. So could we exclude that?
C'est absolument une possibilité.
That's absolutely a possibility. There's another aspect to that, and it's the wealth of seniors. Because with an increase in remuneration in every year, there are fewer transfers from the Government of Canada, and that may be the case in that situation. Lower poverty among Canadians who are seniors, and then there would be a decrease in transfers. But we need to go in depth and analyze the data. Yes, thank you. I'm concerned about the $150 million, the announcement for Radio Canada. A portion will go to CBC to improve the digital experience. So do you have information on the specific breakdown of the amounts between the Anglophone and Francophone services of Radio Canada? No, we don't have that breakdown. We requested it from the Treasury Board Secretariat, and they weren't able to provide it to us. Did they give you a time when they will submit it, or they said, no, not ever? They simply said they did not have the information. We can always follow up and see if we will be able to obtain it. Well, we need to know. I think Francophones outside of Quebec, well.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jakes, I want to ask you a question in regards to the International Monetary Fund's report that was released on Canada, specifically Article 4, which had two findings that I feel are important to mention, given the fact that you have faced criticism from our counterparts across the room over stances you've taken on the new capital and operating definitions, as well as their choice to abandon the long-standing fiscal anchor of debt to GDP. So the IMF came to the exact same conclusion that you did in finding that the Government of Canada's definition of capital is too expansive and should be brought in line with national accounts and GFS standards, and in finding that the Liberals were wrong to abandon the debt to GDP ratio. Can you comment on these findings?
Certainly. So going back, I believe the last time I was at committee testifying before this committee, I did highlight the IMF findings, and in particular the recommendation of returning the debt to GDP anchor to a central role. And I believe that's a direct quote from the IMF Article 4 consultation report. It's certainly something that stood out to us within the office because, again, the government made the changes to its fiscal anchors in the budget. And then this report was published roughly 2 months later. The IMF comes out and says, notwithstanding what you've done in terms of the budget and your fiscal anchors, we think that you should actually go back to what you were doing before with respect to the debt to GDP anchor. So that definitely stood out, and I think we're on our end, we're certainly waiting and watching to see whether the government takes it into account. I noticed the Deputy Minister of Finance was before the Public Accounts Committee a couple of weeks ago, and he indicated that he takes the IMF recommendations with a grain of salt. I would say from my perspective, we'd certainly take them a lot more seriously. And given the prominence that the International Monetary Fund had within Budget 2025 and various quotes in reference to it, potentially there's somebody else in finance or potentially his predecessor also took the IMF recommendations as seriously as well, more seriously.
Thank you very much for that. I want to link that to your report on the supplementary estimates, and specifically in regards to frozen allotments. And in your report, it speaks to frozen allotments being used for 4 principal purposes. And one of those is transferring or reallocating funds, which allows departments to trade authorities across votes, for example, moving capital authorities to operating. Does this create an issue, especially given the new definitions that the Government of Canada has created when it comes to operating in capital?
I don't think so. And there, quickly, because I can see the chair giving me the stink eye. The first thing I'd say is the definitions of operating and capital within the estimates differ from the definitions of operating and capital used in the budget. The new definitions of operating and capital, which again speaks to the point that we've raised in the past, and the International Monetary Fund of having consistent definitions that are widely acknowledged. I'd also say the Auditor General was also before the Public Accounts Committee and indicated that, from her perspective, the new government's new definitions of operating and capital should not be appearing in the public accounts because there's a risk that it would create confusion for parliamentarians, as it does in this situation. Same name, different concept overall. In terms of the transfers between operating and capital, I would say, again, from the reason why it's in there is that parliamentarians initially approved those allocations. So legally, that money was restricted under an operating vote or a capital vote. So hence, when the government wants to make changes, they need to come back to seek Parliament's permission and your permission to actually move the money around. I would say parliamentarians, by and large, have been happy with that approach. If potentially they wanted to go in a different direction, or if they had suggestions, then I think it's something the government would certainly be open to.
Thanks very much. Madame Rochefort.
Oui. Mr. Jacques, thank you for mentioning the communications framework that you've developed. And so I was wondering if you might expand on some of its elements, the major elements of that particular framework.
Thank you for the question. The first and most important element is something that I mentioned at this committee, mentioned to you and at this committee several months ago, and that's a shift in the office to identifying who is the primary audience of our communications, and that's the term that I used, which is parliamentarians first. So there are obviously multiple stakeholders that are targets that have interest for the work of our office, starting with our primary and most important clients, who are identified under the Parliament of Canada Act. So the reason why we exist, parliamentarians, you, the broader public, who have obviously an interest in the work that we're doing, and the media, and then other academic stakeholders. And so one of the first and foremost was we knew that we had all these stakeholders, and it was never written down who the most important stakeholder was and where we should be actually focusing our attention. So that's the first and biggest change. And we'll see if the new parliamentary, whoever the government appoints next week, if they agree with this. But it's the biggest change over the past 20 years, right? So I worked in the office under Kevin Page, Jean-Denis Fréchette, and Yves Giroux, and parliamentarians were there. I can't say that they were first. And for myself, I take a very strict interpretation of the law, and the law says the parliamentarians are our clients, so parliamentarians come first in the communication strategy. As descending out of that is, once you determine that parliamentarians are actually the most important target audience for communications, everything else, when you look at the policies, everything else cascades into place, because in terms of what we are producing, how we're presenting the information, and how we're communicating and transferring that information, everything is focused on what your schedule looks like, how you want to receive it. It may be there's some critique, and there's always critique from academics regarding there's not enough details in the annex with respect to our code. And I take that under consideration. I've never had an experience where a parliamentarian says, I want your 600 lines of code published, or I want your detailed annex. And on our end, if it means we'll do that for an external academic who's not a parliamentarian, and it means that we're producing a report for a parliamentarian more slowly, or it means that one of the 60 reports that we publish a year will not get done because instead we're focusing on another stakeholder, that's certainly problematic. So again, operationally within the office, you see a lot of additional change. You see a lot of additional administrative changes. And I'd say the last thing is around the communication side is very much trying to codify everything we're doing. And I know parliamentarians aren't interested necessarily. They might be interested, but you probably don't have time in the administrative details of how we manage things. But at the very least, putting it out there. So if you do have questions, or one of your staffers has questions, or you want to know how we're operating and you don't like it, you can go on the website, you can find it, you can look through it, you can critique it and get back to us. And that's a major change in comparison to how we operated in the past. So in the past it was, we show up for the reports, we answer technical questions, please appropriate our $8 million a year and don't ask questions. And now it's the inverse. So it's very much, hi, this is what we propose to give to you over the course of the year as our primary clients. Is it meeting your needs? This is how we propose to operate. And if you have suggestions, we're all ears. Because as we've learned with respect to the legislation around the appointment process, there is a lot of flexibility in terms of how we can operate.
Am I still okay?
You have 30 seconds.
Oh. Does the OECD report touches on communication? So do you see a need to update the framework following the report?
The framework will always need to be updated. We'll see how things go. So the framework now is like 6 weeks old. The official version on the website, we've been using something implicit for a far longer period of time. For my part, it's new to us. It's new to parliamentarians. We'll see what you think about it. We'll see what we think about it. I can say within the office, it's definitely new. And I definitely had some pushback with respect to making things more transparent, putting it out there, and having the office held to a higher standard of accountability. But again, things will change over time based upon the demands of clients.
Thanks. Mr. Patzer.
Thanks again. Mr. Jakes, can you just explain to people who will be watching here today the difference between the $5.4 billion that's voted in the subs versus the $7.8 billion in frozen allotments? Because obviously the frozen allotments aren't showing up what's in the voted total of the subs. So can you just explain a little bit more how that works?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So funds that are in permanent frozen allotments were already appropriated, but then TBS restricted those funds and access to those funds, whereas the $5.4 billion are sought authorities, so voted appropriations that you must vote on. Okay,
and then because in the report it says that it's about 27% that you know of. So that $7.8 billion total could actually be a lot higher. Is that correct?
It could be higher as part of total frozen allotments, but we won't know until the public accounts are tabled.
Right, but if it's only 27%, I mean, I know, like Mr. Jakes, you alluded earlier that, you're not going to be harassing public servants to get that information. And that's, to your point, they have another job to do as well. But that could potentially be a lot of money, right? And I think for Canadians trying to get clarity and understanding around how the budget's going to work, following up on what Mrs. Block was saying around capital and expenditure, if there's $7.8 billion frozen there, and that's not even a total amount of what we know there is, as far as transparency goes, there's questions that remain. So is this a standard practice? Is this something that's advised to try to not do, or is this just like a widely accepted practice that money can just be shuffled across departments or frozen and bumped year over year? Because we hear a lot of reannouncements, we hear a lot of again, funding announcements that are, again, it's a reannouncement of old funding and old funding and old funding. That's a regular thing that happens. And yet we see the $7.8 billion in frozen allotments. Are you kind of getting my drift with what I'm trying to ask around transparency here? Like, it's just, I think Canadians have some concern about that. Do you have that concern?
I definitely take your point with respect to the frozen allotments and the ultimate number being higher in the public accounts. They are very good. For the first 10 years of my career, I spent it for sins that my father committed, probably inside the core federal public service, including the Treasury Board Secretariat. And based upon what I saw at that point, there are really good justifications for establishing frozen allotments, especially in situations where there is an announcement made potentially in the budget, and ultimately when there's a proposal submitted to Treasury Board, a detailed proposal, potentially it's not fully cooked, and potentially ministers kick it back and they want to look at it in greater detail. So it actually demonstrates a sign of overall prudence and care in the management of taxpayer resources. In terms of additional transparency, and it really does come down to, on our end, our priorities, as again, our mandate is to promote fiscal transparency. In order to have infinite fiscal transparency, the government wouldn't get anything done. You'd have too many public servants running around trying to generate information for us to analyze. So the trade-off really becomes one of what's a priority for parliamentarians. There are only so many hours in the day, and if it's a priority for this committee to dig deep and go into detail around frozen allotments, and there's a motion, I mention at least 5 or 6 times during all of the 24 committee appearances since September, if there's a motion passed by this committee, it's a priority for us. We have about 40 things on the go on the work plan at any given time, and our ability to trade off and determine that something's going to take longer versus we're going to move it ahead and address it more quickly is based upon the interests of parliamentarians. So again, if it's a really bad itch that you need to scratch at this point and your colleagues agree, then that's something that we'd be happy to look at.
You, in your report and in your research that you did, do you know what the breakdown would be by department of what those frozen allotments are? Like, is there one department that this is a bigger thing for than others? Or, like, I know it's all through Treasury Board, but I mean, if ministers are sending money back or not spending the money, is there one that's a greater offender than the other?
Brief answer.
May I respond, or we? Oh, yes. So, yes, we would be, I may not have the numbers on hand, but we can definitely take a look at frozen allotments per organizations and figure out which departments makes up the bulk of what's being reprofiled.
Okay,
So on and so on.
And that would be
so
pretty
forth.
simple with the data that you have available?
Yes. So we
Perfect.
wouldn't be able.
That is our time, but if you can maybe send that to the clerk, that'd be appreciated, I think. Mr. Gasbro, please.
Thank you, Chair. Statistics Canada reported today and was also reported more widely by Bloomberg that foreign direct investment in Canada jumped in the fourth quarter to the highest level in 18 years. So since approximately 2007, totaling $25.1 billion between October and December of 2025. So I sort of want to pivot off that foreign direct investment figure and relate it to a comment you made earlier, sir, in regards to the Canadian economy growing with our population staying flat in 2025 and 2026. Can you just drill down a little bit on our productivity growth? And I would then like to follow up with a sort of forward-looking view from you in regards to where you see productivity gains coming from within our economy.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So in terms of today's FDI, foreign direct investment release, Obviously, it's good news, and we'll take what all of us should take what we can get at this point. Any greenery that we can see poking up through the snow, especially in cold Ottawa, is definitely thankful. More broadly speaking, in terms of the economy itself, I always like to think of the economy as you have people that work. So you count the number of people that you have, 18 to 64 within the working age population. That's been pretty much flat over the past year. We expect it's going to be flat, or at least based upon our estimates from this morning, in 2026. Then you have for the people that are working, you have the level of effort that they're engaging in, presuming that they have jobs. And then you have the final component, which you highlighted, which is productivity. Productivity growth in Canada has been uneven since the pandemic, so it's been pretty volatile. It wasn't particularly strong, so there was a reduction in growth in productivity that we saw over the previous decade or so, which I believe led one of the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada to highlight that as a significant challenge for Canadians and the Canadian economy. In terms of our economic modeling, I would say in the short term, looking at our most recent economic and fiscal outlook, we do continue to have some unevenness in growth in the Canadian economy. So there's a lot going on, both in terms of changes. So on the demographic side, we had substantial increases in the size of the population, now flat, returning to something more normal. There's a lot of uncertainty with respect to trade agreements. The trade data has been particularly volatile at this point. We do have what I would characterize as a very defensible assumption that over the medium term, so looking at years 3 and years 4, we start to return to productivity growth and economic growth that looks something more akin to what we saw prior to the pandemic. And again, the underlying assumption is what drives Canadian growth, what drives growth in the economy and also productivity growth are the people in the Canadian economy who work and start businesses and operate those businesses. And we still have the same people in the economy. They've demonstrated their resilience in responding to shocks in the past with various types of supports at the federal level and the provincial level. And at this point, there's no reason to assume that the same will not continue once we get through the current sticky period we're currently in.
Thank you for that. And I agree that our economy is based around our men and women within the Canadian economy. Sticking to the foreign direct investment and attracting capital into our economy, I'm making the natural assumption, sir, that you agree with our new government's view in terms of strengthening trade relationships with reliable trading partners, allowing our businesses to get their goods and services into foreign markets is incredibly positive and is a prerequisite for us having sustainable growth within our economy in the long term.
I'm afraid we're past our time, but maybe Mr. Jakes, you can get back to your opinion in writing if you so wish. We'll have Madame Gaudreau for 2.5, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll pick up on old age security and the guaranteed income supplement. The department is lowering its forecasts for those receiving OAS by $1.6 billion and GIS $773 million. But there's an increase in our senior population. Statistically, the gap, what conclusion can we draw between the forecast and demographics? Perhaps just mention it's an adjustment based on the forecast at the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, in the main estimates, $94 billion was forecast for the 3 types of payments. So 1.5 in readjustment. the explanations from TBS are that there are some seniors who had higher incomes, and so after a certain threshold, there's a clawback for OAS, and GIS is for those who are less fortunate. So it's about 2% of the estimate from the beginning of the year. However, for next year in the budget, $87 billion, or 88 were forecast. The following year, 94, 95 billion. So there is an increase in the population that will increase costs. I'd really like to see the correlation to see if the curve follows. But why was there that 1.5 review? I don't know if the estimates were poorly calculated at the beginning of the year, or they were a little bit more prudent, and now they see that not as much will be spent. Okay. It's not reassuring to me in the buying power of our seniors. I have 30 seconds left. I just wanted to know why the amounts for national defense are in supplementary estimates and not in the main estimates. In one sentence, please. For you.
Programs evolve in such a way that they identify the need for money at this point in the year, where they didn't in the start of the year when the main estimates are being crafted.
Thank you very much. We're going to suspend in a moment. We also just have to approve a couple of quick budgets at the end. Before we suspend to bring in our OECD guests, can I just ask quickly, the Vote 50, $1 billion, it looks to me a lot like the old Vote 40 slush fund from, I think it was 2017, 2018, where the government was asking Parliament to approve money without telling us what it's for. Do you have any thoughts on this, our inability to provide oversight or actually even know what we're voting on for that $1 billion? Because it's...
So I do recall Treasury Board vote, the short-lived Treasury Board vote 40, and I would go back to a point that I made earlier that it really is up to parliamentarians to decide whether the government's justification for additional flexibility, requesting additional flexibility through these central votes, outweighs parliamentarians ceding authority and control around the spending. Because again, in the case of Vote 40, the vote wording, to the best of my knowledge or the best of my recall, was quite similar. But again, it's parliamentarians decide how they want to approve the money, and how much discretion you want to provide to the government, and whether that discretion is appropriate or not.
Yeah. Well, I recall the Vote 40 debate where government officials said it was presumptuous on MPs' behalf to know what they were voting on before the money. And this seems like another case. And I considering it's 5 to 10 years to get anything to project basis with defense spending, I find it bizarre that they need $1 billion. Can I just ask quickly, what happens March 3rd if we don't have a new PBO announced and in the role?
So thank you for the question. Pursuant to the Parliament of Canada Act, there are several specific responsibilities that are tied directly to the individual who is the Parliamentary Budget Officer. That includes publishing reports. It includes taking requests from parliamentarians and from committees. And it involves sending or requesting information from government departments. So the office will still exist. We will still be doing work, and we will only be doing work on projects or requests that we've already received. All new requests submitted by parliamentarians will need to wait for a Parliamentary Budget Officer to officially receive them.
Such as a brief on the estimates that just came in today.
Correct. Reports. So you can still, parliamentarians can still request.
But we wouldn't have a public report on the estimates.
We would be legally, there'd be no legal ability to publish a report from the office because of the way that legislation is structured.
Great. And just one last quick question, Mr. Creighton. 32.2 of the Canada Post Act about this $2 billion. It's very clear when you look at the Canada Post strategic report that they have no inability to repay this money. It says the write-off has to appear in the next estimates, which should have been in the mains. Should they not be putting in a provision for the bad debt for this? Or at what point do they, like, the money will never be repaid. Canada Post seems pretty clear. The Kaplan report says that. Like, why would the government be delaying, do you think, recording that write-off?
I don't have an answer for you why they would be doing that. Our understanding is that it would appear in Supplementary Estimate C of 2026-27.
Right, but it has the Act says the next estimates, not the next estimates at the end of the year when the government gets around to it. Like, would they not be required under the Canada Post Act to actually write it off, to show it earlier? In your opinion, or
I would say that's a legal question.
Okay.
It's not a PBO question.
Perfect. You can get back to us, Mr. Brayton. Anyways, thanks very much. We're going to suspend for very quickly and bring our next witness in. Thanks.